So here we are, and welcome to the very first video on my YouTube channel. I haven't even come up with a name for this channel yet, so by the time you see this video, it will have a name. I'm not going to be shouting it out because I don't know what it is just yet. So I figured it was finally time to upgrade my PC, because this PC is about 7 years old since I first built it. I have upgraded it since. So at the time, my budget was around £500 to build myself a workstation that was designed for web development. Now, it wasn't supposed to be designed for gaming, although in the back of my mind that is what I wanted to do. So when I first built it, I actually built it with one of the cheapest graphic cards I could find at the time. Now, I have upgraded it since. Right now, it has an NVIDIA GeForce 970 in it, which still to this day is pretty powerful, but of course, because of CPU bottlenecks, I am having issues playing games at higher resolutions. So apart from the graphics card, I have also updated the RAM. I did that quite a few years ago. So it has got 16 gigabytes of RAM in here, which is pretty much the same that you would find in a brand new MacBook Pro. But obviously this is a much older version. It's DDR3 instead of DDR4 or DDR5, which we have now. But I've also got a number of hard drives in here, so that's something that I have definitely been upgrading to the max. So I have one graphics card. I have one hard drive for my games, so I store all of my games on there. I also have a hard drive for all my raw footage, so that's where that goes when I'm doing video editing and whatnot. But I've also got two SSDs in there, one of them with the Windows operating system on it, and the other has a Linux operating system, which you can actually see just here. In the last couple of weeks since we have been in lockdown, I've been much more dependent on my PC, because the setup that I have for the PC is much better than the setup I have for my MacBook. So I have been sitting at my desk a lot more with this PC, trying to do some web development, but I found that Windows and Docker doesn't really work well together. I won't go into details on that, but I eventually found that if I switched to Ubuntu or just any kind of Linux, I chose Ubuntu, that I can actually get and squeeze as much performance out of this as possible, because Windows, for whatever reason, bloatware and whatnot, runs extremely slowly to the point where I can't actually do some of my development on this PC anymore. So switching to Ubuntu has worked, but it's still incredibly slow. So today I have decided to upgrade to an AMD Ryzen 5 third generation processor. Now you can pick one of these up. I did from Curry's for about £165. You may find it cheaper elsewhere, but CPUs these days have actually come right down in price. So this is actually one of the most recommended CPUs for the budget market. So before I begin upgrading my PC and just putting this in, I have to point out that an upgrade from an AMD FX 6300 to a Ryzen 5 just isn't possible. And the reason for that is because the Ryzen 5 has a different socket to the AMD FX 6300. Now essentially what that means is I actually need to upgrade a few more components, which is why I haven't done it until this point, because I also need to upgrade the motherboard to support the CPU. So for the motherboard, I've gone for the Asus Prime B450MA. This is definitely a budget board for this processor. You can pick one of these up for just under £80. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Because I have upgraded both the processor and the motherboard, I also need to upgrade the RAM. Again, one of the reasons why I haven't updated the CPU to this date. For the RAM, I've decided to go for this Corsair Vengeance Pro RGB 16GB kit. Even though these have RGB, that's not the reason why I got it. I actually got it because it's a very trusted brand, and it's also got a speed of 3200 megahertz, which is going to help me squeeze the most performance out of the board and essentially my PC. So one thing that I did get that I didn't actually need for this upgrade is an M.2 SSD, which should be much faster than the SSDs that I'm currently using for the operating system. So the operating system will go on this one because it's 250 gigabytes, and everything else should work just fine. So those are the components that I'm going to be using for the upgrade. I'm going to be reusing some of the components that are already in this PC, but for now, let's turn off this computer and let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to need is the box that the motherboard came in. We're essentially going to be using this as our little workbench. Next, we're going to want to get our motherboard and place this very carefully onto our box, like that. Now that we have our motherboard ready to go, let's just move that to one side for now, because we are going to get our CPU out of the box. Now, the great thing about most CPUs is that they will actually come with a cooler. Now, that is our CPU, and there's some pamphlets in there, but inside the box you will find a CPU cooler. Now this is what's called a stock cooler because it's the cooler that comes with the CPU. Now I'm going to take it out this way because we want to be very careful of the other side, because on this side it already has some thermal paste applied. When we're handling the CPU, we want to be very careful with it, so you may not be able to see it. The plastic is designed in such a way that you can pick up the CPU by the sides without touching the pins. So one thing to note about the CPU is that it should have a little gold triangle in one of the corners. This is important because we're going to be using this triangle to line up the CPU correctly on our motherboard. So now that we have our motherboard ready to go and our CPU in our hand, we're going to lift up this retention arm, which is nice and simple, and we're going to look for that triangle. So now that we have found our triangle, we're going to line the two up and place our CPU very carefully in the socket. Now we should see that the CPU is now flush within the socket. It should just drop in without needing to put any pressure on it. You shouldn't put any pressure on it just in case you break the pins. But now that it is essentially flush with the motherboard, we can now close that retention arm, which should be nice and easy until it locks into place. Now that is the CPU installed. The next thing that we need to do is install the CPU cooler. Now, the cooler that comes with the CPU, it actually has a slightly different mounting points. So we need to remove these brackets here in order to install this cooler. Taking these brackets off should be nice and simple. So essentially we are just going to unscrew it. It shouldn't be too tight, so it should be nice and simple for you to unscrew it. So I should probably point out, while I am unscrewing these brackets, is the reason why we build most of the computer outside of the case is because you essentially give yourself more room to work with. So obviously if you were to install the motherboard first, it would be a lot harder to put the all the components into the computer, because you've got a much smaller space to work with, and also the fact that you have a lot more light when it's outside the case than inside of the case. So now we are going to position the CPU cooler very carefully on top of our CPU, making sure to line up the screws before we place it down, just like that. Right, so now that we have the CPU cooler positioned on top of our CPU, we're going to want to screw it in a diagonal pattern. So you want to do a cross pattern to screw it in. Now, when you first screw it in, you don't want to go all the way. You just want to keep going back and forth in that cross pattern to make sure that the thermal paste has been evenly distributed across the CPU. So essentially, when it comes to installing RAM, we want to make sure that we install it into the correct slots to make the most out of the dual channel support that this board has. Obviously we have bought a dual channel kit, so these are two 8GB sticks of RAM. So essentially we want to be installing it in the first two slots. Now when you first look at this board, you're probably assuming that the first two slots are either these two here or these two here. In fact, the first two slots have been color coded, so it's the grey slots here that we want to be using. So let's go ahead and install the RAM. What will help you install the RAM is this little notch here. There's a little notch on the RAM stick, which will basically show you which way to install it. There is only one way to install these, and that is this way. So because it opens up on this side here, we want to make sure that we slot it in nicely on this side before pushing it down. And when you push it down, you should hear it click in two different places. So that is now firmly secured into our motherboard. We can now move on to our second one, and again, making sure that the notches will line up for us. Position it, push it in, hear that click twice. So there we go, that is the RAM installed on our board. Now the last thing that we're going to be installing before moving on to the case itself is the M.2. So on this board we have a single M.2 slot, which is this slot here. It's probably quite difficult to see at this particular camera angle, but essentially this slot here is the M.2 slot. In order to install this, we need to install it into this slot here, and you'll see that it will line up nicely with this hole here. So what we need to do before we install it is install our little riser. Right, so there we go. We have now installed the little riser. We need to be very careful of the little tiny screw because we're going to need that in a second. But let's go ahead and install our M.2. Again, there is really only one way to position it, and what helps is, again, you've got a little notch which will line up with a notch that's in here. So we're just going to push that in on the side very carefully, like that, and so it should fit in like that. Now, with it poking up like that, there's nothing to worry about because we are going to be securing it in a second with this little screw here. So unhelpfully, this isn't a magnetic screwdriver. So we are going to need to position this very carefully in order to screw it in. Like that. Oh, ruined it. Oh, it's so fiddly. You definitely need a magnetic screwdriver for this. Okay, so there we go. Finally managed to get it right. So that is now screwing in, so it'll be nice and secure on our board. There we go. So that's pretty much it for everything that needs to be done outside of the case. It's now time to put it inside our case. Now, instead of using the old case, what I've decided to do is get myself a new one. I have decided to go for this really nice, stylish Corsair 275R, which again is a very budget case. It was only £75 off of eBuyer. But this is a really nice case with some really nice features in it as well. So one of the great things about this case is the cable management. So you will see that we've got this section here, which is inside the case itself. This can be used to hide away most of the cables. So rather than it being a complete mess, they can all be hidden away inside of this compartment here. The other really nice feature about cable management are all of these holes which you can route your cabling through. Okay, so unfortunately my camera decided to run out of space. So the only thing that you have missed is me installing the motherboard, which is a relatively straightforward process. You just need to install the I/O shield into the case the right way, and then place the motherboard on top. Now, for this particular case, because of the size of the motherboard, I have had to reposition two of the standoffs. Now, it's fairly simple to do. You just unscrew them and screw them in the correct place. Now with the motherboard in place, we can go ahead, and what I've already done is unscrew these two covers here. So this is essentially what we're going to be, the slots that we're going to be using for the graphics card. There isn't anything wrong with the graphics card that I've got. This is the NVIDIA GeForce 970, which is a pretty good graphics card. The only bottleneck I had, and the reason why I couldn't get the most performance out of it, is because of the CPU I was using at the time. Now it has a new, or the latest generation of CPU in the PC. I should be able to get this to max performance. So let's go ahead and slot that in. There is really only one way that this can go. Much like the RAM, we just need to push it in ever so slightly until it clicks. So there is a little thing, I can't remember what the name is, but that will click into place. With that in place, we just go ahead and screw these on. Okay, so now with the graphics card installed, we're going to go ahead and turn the case over. This will allow us to install the power supply. There is only really one right way to connect this, and this is fan down, because essentially we want the airflow to be going out through the bottom of the case, because that's where the air filter is. So we're going to go ahead and install this like so. So much like before, we're going to screw these in a criss-cross pattern. There are essentially two cables that we need to thread through, the first of which is this cable here. And this one simply slots in to this part here. Nice and simple, like so. And we need to make sure that it is in securely, otherwise our motherboard isn't going to work correctly. So this cable here is the CPU power. Now this cable actually lives over here somewhere, so we've got this nice little hole here that we can actually thread it through, so we're going to do that now. So we're going to go ahead and slot that in the right way. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to want to plug in is our GPU. So we're going to need a power, and essentially this is going to take a 6 plus 2 plus another 6 here. So we're going to thread those through now, and likely we're going to thread them through this little hole down here. Okay, so the two cables that we need are these PCI Express power cables, and these are in a 6 plus 2 configuration on both sides. So they're both exactly the same. And what we're going to do is thread it through the bottom here, because that's where our GPU lives. So essentially we want to place that in. And again, there is only one right way to do it. And I'm doing it wrong. So it needs to go in this way, like so. It is a little bit fiddly, especially when you got this piece on the end. But essentially that will go in like so. We just need to make sure that that slots in nicely with that little click there. We also need to do the same with the other side, but because this is only 6 and not 8, we don't need this one here. So we're just going to plug this in. Again, only one right way to put it, and that is like so, and wait for the click. And that's it. Okay, cool. So that is basically it for power that we need to hook up to the motherboard and the GPU. We're not going to plug in any extra hard drives because I have got the NVMe SSD right there. So the only thing left to do is plug in everything from the front ports. So that is the USB 3 header, plus the audio and the power. The power is a little bit fiddly because it's essentially down here and you need to get them in the correct position. But I can't really show you that. So I am going to have to say, if you want to see what position these need to go in, go check out another video. I'm sure somebody has done it with the motherboard outside of the case. Right, okay, so now I basically have all of the cables installed. I've got the all the power cables and the LEDs Those are installed now. I've got the USB 3 from the front panel, and I've also got the HD audio as well that comes in from the front panel. I've also gone ahead and installed the 2 chassis fans. So this fan here, I've routed the cable round the back and up through here. Unfortunately, there isn't really very much that I can do with this cable here, unless I was to tuck it over there, and that does actually hide it a little bit better. I've also got this fan, which kind of routes behind here and loops back. I don't actually need to do that, because what I could do is have it loop up and round and then back down there. That might mean it's a little bit tidier. The next things to do before we put the side panels on and to tidy up all the cabling is to actually plug it all in and make sure everything works. So we need to make sure that the machine actually posts, and that is essentially showing us the BIOS screen. So what I can show you with it upright is the cable management on the front is definitely looking a lot better than what it used to. On the back, I do still need to do a little bit of work to tidy that up, but that's something that I can do offline or not on the video. So let's get this all hooked up to the monitor and see if this thing posts. But here we go. Let's first turn this on, and we should see everything looking nice. We've got some LEDs to show us everything is connected, which is great. So let's go ahead and press the button, and hopefully that looks good. That looks really good. I'm quite glad that I actually got some RGB lights now. So hopefully we should now see the system post. Now there isn't a hard drive on with Windows installed, so I do actually have a USB which I'll be using to install Windows. But for now, it looks like everything is running absolutely fine. So we've got a light on, there we go. And that's it. We have now posted. So the important thing to do before you shut everything up is to make sure that you have got all 16 gigs of RAM that we've installed. So we can see that it's DDR4 and it's currently clocked at 2133 megahertz. Now these are 3200 megahertz sticks, so we can overclock that a little bit later on. USB devices, we've got none. We've got a detected ATA device, which I guess is our SSD. And we've got a new CPU installed, so we need to make sure that we enter the system setup. So we don't have a keyboard plugged in, so I'm going to plug that in now. Okay, so essentially what we're looking at here on this screen is we are seeing our motherboard temperature. We can see our RAM in the corner there. We've got it plugged into DIMM A2 and B2. Unfortunately, we don't have an M.2, which is a bit confusing because we do have an M.2 installed. Here. This is our M.2, so I'm not entirely sure why it's saying NA there when it can see it over here. So that was a little bit confusing there. But you can see that everything is working smoothly. You can see our AMD Ryzen 5 has also been recognized with its 6 cores and a current speed of 3600 megahertz. So right now I'm not going to touch anything in terms of overclocking. I will come back to this at some point, but the first thing that I want to do is to make sure that everything works the way that it is intended to. So I'm just going to go to save and exit. Didn't make any changes, but we're going to go ahead and boot into our USB to install Windows on our SSD. Right, okay, so that is pretty much it in terms of installing Windows. So that's currently going ahead as we speak. I will need to jump onto that and set it all up and everything. But that is pretty much Windows installed on the NVMe SSD that we have installed. I'm really interested to see how much performance I'm going to get out of the graphics card, purely because the old CPU that I had was definitely a bottleneck. So I'm sure I'll be able to play some of my favourite games with much higher resolution. But for now, guys, I just want to say thank you ever so much for sticking with me. This is actually the second time I have built a PC by myself. Obviously, if you want to see more of my videos, because I have quite a few planned, hit the subscribe button, and yeah,